Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's had a good week so far. I know everybody's getting excited about Thanksgiving and turkey and all that stuff. Josh is not with us tonight. Him and his family are traveling, I think, to the coast to see Mariah's family. So we will carry on tonight. It's been I got to look, and it's actually been quite a while since I spoke and taught this class. The last time I did teach it, we were going through this book. And I know y'all can't really see this book, but it's called a Flex series book. It's called Living Like Jesus. I'm speaking tonight. Actually, we'll speak again not next Wednesday night, but the week after that. So what I thought I would do is just pick up in this. Kind of want to quickly go through what we have done so far, and then we'll get into our topic, and then what we don't get done this week, we'll finish up next week. And then, whatever we have after that. This book is called the Flex series. I'm going to talk just a little bit about that just so you kind of remember what we were doing and how we were going. It's called Living Like Jesus. And we had a discussion when we first started this about, why that's important, why we want to live like Jesus and study something about living like Jesus. Of course, it's a pretty, I would think, a kind of a no-brainer is our standards, our example is why we would want to do something like this. Just really quickly, this Flex series, I really like these. I have a couple of these at home. They're quite a few chapters, but they're really short. They're written by members of the church. They have really flexible usage. You can kind of use chapters. Some chapters you like, some chapters you don't like. You don't have to use it. You can use others. They have a variety of studies. You have topical Old Testament, New Testament kind of stuff. It's really, really broad and topics that you could use it for. So it's just something if you want to add that to your library. The lessons lay out like this. You have a warm-up. It's more like just a couple paragraphs to get you going. You have a workout, which is kind of the main point of the lesson. A cool down, which is kind of another story that ties everything together. And then it has discussion questions that you can use if you're teaching a class. So it helps a little bit. Briefly, I want to go through what we've done so far up to this point. Not really any in-depth stuff, just kind of get us to where we want to be. We talked about the first lesson is living a new life. And as you talk about being like Jesus, we talk about living a new life. And we talk about living a new life, the first thing you have to have is a change of heart. Okay? If we're going to be something new, if we're going to be something different, there has to be a change. And typically, if you're not committed to the change, if it doesn't come within you, you're typically not going to hold on to that change. Correct? So you have to have a change of heart. Jesus says we have to follow Him. Okay, we have to be followers of Christ, and Jesus tells us to pick up our cross and follow Him daily. So following Jesus isn't something that we just half-heartedly do. That's something, again, kind of like the change of heart. It's something you have to commit to doing each and every day, or you typically don't last very long. Had to have a new birth. This is, various religious circles, this becomes a hot topic of a new birth. And kind of my summation of it is Jesus himself tells us that we have to be born again, correct? In John chapter 3, he tells Nicodemus, you cannot see the kingdom of God unless you are born again. So to me, that kind of ends the story there. But again, to living a new life, there has to be a new birth. You have to give away what you were doing, start something new. Then we're told we have an abundant life. Now, abundant life doesn't necessarily mean we have cars and boats and houses and all this material stuff. Having those things are nice and good, but an abundant life means we have a full life as a Christian, and also not necessarily in this life, but we have an abundant life in the next life. Okay? Second thing we talked about was resisting Satan. We talked a lot. Spent quite a bit of time on this one. We talked about the perception of Satan. We talked a lot about kind of what we think of when we see or hear the word Satan. Kind of what pops in our head, and it's interesting. We talked a good bit about it, that most of our perception of Satan and the things that pop in our head don't particularly come from the Bible. They actually, most specifically, they come from a book called The Divine Comedy, written by Dante, which is kind of interesting when you get into the study of that, if the visual things that pop in your head. So we talked a good bit about that. We talked about Satan in the Old Testament and Satan in the New Testament. Specifically, we talked about Satan and Job, their conversations, and what all Job went through. We then, of course, talked about Satan and Jesus. Of course, the main point we talked about there was, of course, in Matthew 4, 1 through 11, and when Jesus is tempted and tried. And the big thing we want to talk about there is how Satan comes after us when we're most vulnerable. That's when he's looking and trying to get any access he can to our lives, and typically that comes when we let our guard down, when when one moment of weakness and at the wrong time, and he's there. So we have to constantly be on guard for that. We talked about the first temptation of stones to bread. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. We talked about the second temptation of Jesus being tempted to jump from the tower or the temple. And then lastly, we talked about Jesus, the temptation of worshiping Satan himself. And the piece I want to bring up with that was because I'm like, you're probably like me, you've read these temptations of Jesus and Satan probably many, many times. And this one, as I was studying this book, one point came out to me that I not really thought about, but if Jesus had failed to this temptation, if he had said, okay, I'll worship Satan, what was the one thing that would have eliminated? Nobody? Come on. If Jesus had worshipped Satan and he said that I'm going to rule this world, he would not have went to the cross. He would have omitted the cross. And that, to me, I thought about that and I was like, wow, it just kind of one of those things I never really dawned on me as I was reading it. But I mean, Jesus, even though he was God in the flesh, he still was flesh. And nobody who be in their, quote, right mind wants to harm themselves. So, I mean, we all read this, we all know the story of Jesus in the agony and on the cross. So if he had done this, if he had worshipped Satan, he would have essentially took a shortcut and not had to go through that. But of course, that wasn't the plan. And Jesus, again, rebuked Satan, and we all know the story of that. So I know that was a quick kind of wrap up where we're at. So that being said, that leaves us where we'll start tonight. And we're going to talk about valuing the kingdom. Matthew 4, 45 and 46 is, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant searching for fine pearls. When he found a pearl of great value, he went out and sold everything he had and bought it. So we're going to talk about how we value the kingdom. And just so you know, we're going to use the word kingdom a lot, just so you are prepared. So here's the warm-up. It says there is some truth in the old saying, one man's trash is another man's treasure. That beat-up piece of furniture that you or I think should be in the local thrift store may be a valuable antique to a collector. Even so, what is valuable today may not be so tomorrow. Also, when it comes to a value, looks can be deceiving. That Tiffany lamp, that Civil War sword, Chippendale chair may look valuable, but you may discover later that it is an imitation or a fake. I had to look up what a Tiffany lamp and Chippendale chair was. I had no clue what those are. In case some of y'all may know, but they're really expensive pieces of furniture. In the end, it is only those things that are genuine and will last forever that will never lose their value. There is only one thing that can completely meet those criteria, and that is the kingdom of God. Someone please read Luke chapter 1, verses 32 through 33, please. Because I know y'all don't want to y'all don't want to listen to me speak the whole time, so we'll get everybody involved. So of all the things we talked about, all the things that we see around us, all the things that we have, this building, these pews, this podium, our vehicles, everything we have around us, those things will go away, right? I mean, they will at some point in time cease to exist. I mean, the warm-up we talked about, where am I going? Oh, I need to point that way. All these things we have, all these treasures that we have in this life, that we own, that we have, they're not genuine. They will not last forever. There's only one thing that we have that will last forever. The second law of thermodynamics, and I'm not going to have a physics class up here just so y'all know, is essentially called the law of decay. And in the simplest terms, it just means everything breaks down. Everything at some point in time breaks down except one thing. Revelation 21, verses 1 through 4 says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and earth had ceased to exist, and the sea exists no more. And I saw a holy city in the New Jerusalem descending out of heaven from God, made ready like a bride adorned for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, the resident of God is among human beings. He will live among them. They will be his people, and God will be with them.'" And can you turn to verse 4? He says, "I will wipe away every tear from every eye. Death will not exist anymore. No mourning, no crying, no pain, for the former things have ceased to exist." So this kingdom that we're talking about, this kingdom of God, is eternal. It's always going to be around. Will someone please read Psalm 45, verse 6, please? Now, come on, y'all don't quit being too shy. Mm-hmm. Your throne, O God, is permanent. New English Standard, the same thing. Someone please read Hebrews 12, verse 28. I'm going to start calling on Daniel since he knows all these by heart. Hebrews 12, verse 28. So we have an unshakable kingdom. So all these verses have the one thing in common. This kingdom is permanent, it's unshakable, it's everlasting. So, all these things around us are not going to be here except one thing. So, let's talk about valuing the kingdom. Why do you use the word kingdom? We're going to have a brief history lesson in case y'all didn't know. You ever thought about that? You ever thought about why we read so much in the New Testament and the Old Testament, for that matter, and it talks so much about a kingdom? Yeah, it's the same kind of thing. But specifically, I guess because what I'm fishing for is, why do we use that word so much? So let's think back to the New Testament. Let's think back to the first century. What was the world like at that point in time? For us, living in 2019 in Ripley, Mississippi, in the United States of America, where all of us have grown up and lived our whole lives, this term right here is sort of foreign to us, right? We have always lived in a democracy. I mean, we have a Declaration of Independence that says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Is that what the world was like in the Old Testament and the New Testament? Oh, yes, no. What was the world like? Emperors, rulers, war, violence, right? I mean, it was completely different. The people of the first century very well understood what a kingdom was, right? And if we think about, I mean, as the Israelites went into captivity, Judah went into captivity, who put them there? other kingdoms, right? I mean, other kingdoms. Even in the first century, Rome wasn't necessarily. They were there. They weren't necessarily imprisoning them and beating them, but Rome was in Jerusalem. They didn't like that. They understood that. So this idea of a kingdom is definitely a cultural thing, and something that we have a hard time kind of getting our hands around. And also, that kind of thing that leads to sometimes, we read the Bible and we really need to understand the time frame when it was written. We need to understand, who it was written to. We need to understand the culture that it was written to, because the reality is the Bible was written to a Eastern culture. It wasn't written for me sitting here in Mississippi in a Western type culture. There's just certain things that are different that we have a hard time kind of sometimes understanding. We read it, we're like, well, that shouldn't be that way. Well, put yourself back to where you were at that point in time, and then it starts to make a little more sense. So if we think about the kings and we think about kingdoms, who was the first king for the Jewish people? Anybody? No one wants to take a shot at it? Daniel, buddy, I'm just going to keep picking on you. You know the answer. Who was the first king? For the Jewish people. Go all the way back to the beginning of Old Testament. First king. Anybody? Close. I tricked you. God was the first king. I'm sorry, I set you up. I apologize for that. I really did. I was hoping he'd say that. Technically you're right, but technically you're wrong. God was the first king, but you're right. You're right. So the people then said God wasn't good enough, right? So they wanted Saul. So Saul was their king. What did God, through the prophet Samuel, tell them when they asked for a king? I'll pick on David. I won't pick on Daniel anymore. Told him what? That you ain't gonna like it. We'll just kind of paraphrase it, right? Said you don't know what you're asking for. You don't know what's going to happen. He essentially told him, you're rejecting me because you're asking for something and you don't know what you're going to get. This isn't what you need. It's also interesting if you take that and you keep going forward with it. When you get to the New Testament, what were the people wanting in the New Testament? When you get to the Matthew, Mark, the Gospels, what were the people waiting for? A king. Same thing. They referred to it as they were looking for another king, right? But it's kind of come full circle. You're wanting a king in 1 Samuel. You're wanting a king in Matthew. Now, they did learn a little because they realized they messed up with the first king, wanting the first kings in the Old Testament, and they realized they wasn't what they needed. But so now they're looking for another king that was, supposed to would. They knew of this everlasting because the prophets had told them that a king was coming that would set up an everlasting kingdom. So they were looking for this kingdom, but it ultimately didn't. It wasn't the one that they got that they thought the one that they were looking for. So we have everything kind of coming full circle and talking about this kingdom and what the people of the Jewish people were getting and looking for. So let's keep talking about this idea. So let's talk about this again. We're doing a little history lesson here. So what were some of the most powerful kingdoms of that time and any other time for that matter? I'm among the nerdy things that I am. I'm a history nerd. So Tanya knows how nerdy I am. So what are some of the most powerful kingdoms that you can think of? Egyptians, that was number one on my list. It also because they're near and dear to the Bible, right? I mean, Egypt is a major kingdom, especially in the after in Genesis and Exodus, and really up until one of these other kingdoms we'll talk about comes on the scene. They're pretty much a major world power at the time. It was, yeah. I mean, especially right after they crossed over and defeated Jericho. Yeah, I mean, they were really strong. You're right. You're absolutely right. I have the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and of course, Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians. Those are near and dear to our heart in studying, especially the Old Testament, right? Because the Babylonians, of course, took away the tribe of Judah, what was left. The Assyrians took away the tribe of Israel. So the Assyrians came first, and the Babylonians came and kind of took them over. If we kind of leave the world of the Old Testament, we have the Athenians. Okay, the Athenians are what we consider modern-day Greece. After those, we have the Macedonians that kind of took them over, and Macedonians are important for one person. Where's my history nerds? There's my history nerd. All right. Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great essentially conquered pretty much the known world at that time, from Greece through Egypt all the way over to India. Of course, we have the Romans. Of course, the Romans are near and dear to Americans because our model of government is based somewhat on how Rome did theirs. We have the Maurya, Maurya. Now, this is a Indian kingdom, and they're sort of important because after Alexander the Great had to leave because his men got tired of fighting, this group came in and took over what was left, so they grew in big power. We have the Qin, the Han dynasties in China. They were extremely important and influential in that area. Come a little closer to home, that we all remember from history classes. We have the Incas, we have the Aztecs, we have the Mayans in their day and time were huge powers. We have the Mongols. Of course, they're popular because of Genghis Khan, and the Gauls, which were in France, that led to kind of Middle Age kings and those kind of things. That's way more history than you wanted, I understand. But the thing I want to bring up about all these kingdoms, we named 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, about 15 kingdoms there. What is the common thing in all those kingdoms? Other than maybe one, because Tim mentioned one. Even that one too. What's the common theme of all those? They're gone. They're not here anymore, right? Kind of goes back to our law of thermodynamics. Everything is breaking down. All these kingdoms were major powers at their time. I mean, they ruled the world at that point in time, and now they're gone, right? We have a great discussion in the book of Daniel about some kingdoms, right? This one is all near and dear to heart, and this one is really interesting because God, through Daniel, I mean, we all these kingdoms we named, He gives everybody a really, oh, by the way, this is about to happen, and He was absolutely every one of these came to be. Of course, we all know the story of Nebuchadnezzar and his dream. We're not going to read this whole thing, but I will get down here and tell you just a little bit about it. It says, O king, you are the king of kings. By the way, this is in Daniel 2, chapter 2. We'll start in verse 37. It says, You, O king, are king of kings. The God of heaven has granted you sovereignty, power, strength, and honor. Wherever human beings, wild animals, birds of the sky live, He has given them into your power. He's given you authority over them. You are the head of gold. He's talking to Nebuchadnezzar. I know it may be a little hard for you to read that, but Nebuchadnezzar is this, right? So he is this head of gold. He says, then after you, another kingdom will arise, one inferior to yours. And Carla mentioned the Medes and the Persians. So right here you have these, which you have two arms, which represent the Medes and the Persians. They came in after Babylon, took them over. It says, then a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule all of the earth. All of the earth. That is the Macedonian Greek Empire, which was Alexander the Great that we mentioned a while ago. We'll keep reading on this, and he says in verse 41, it says, in that you are seeing, back up. Verse 40 says, then there will be a fourth kingdom, a strong one like iron, But just like iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything as iron breaks, all in pieces, all these metals, it will so break in pieces and crush the other one. So you have the feet or the legs here of iron. That represents the Romans. The Romans were the next power that came in. This article is actually, I've not really thought much about it, but this article mentions that you have 2 feet because Rome was divided east and west at a point in its history, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then you have the toes of the feet of the clay. It says, verse 41, in that you're seeing feet and toes were partially wet with clay and partly of iron. This is a divided kingdom. Some of the strength of iron will be divided, for you saw mixed with that. Ultimately, this is kind of the end of Rome. Okay, at the end of Rome, if you look at Rome's history, they had some really bad emperors. Things went kind of really downhill for them. It was bad. So this was a very broken, divided kingdom. What's important in talking about all of this is God, through Daniel, is telling us, all right, you're here, this one's coming, this one's coming, this one's coming, these are coming, and after they come, what's going to happen? In verse 44 of Daniel chapter 2, it says, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will raise up an everlasting kingdom. So he's telling them way back there in Daniel, when all this happens, when we get here in history, something big is coming, right? So all these things that are passing away, something big is coming here at this point. Okay. Any questions? Any comments? Y'all still with me, right? All right. All right. So valuing the kingdom. So let's read some verses here. So we're talking about Jesus and the kingdom of God. Somebody please read Matthew 2, verses 1 and 2. So we've looked at kingdoms in the Old Testament. We've seen Daniel tell us that all these things are happening, that all of these things are coming. So now we fast forward to the New Testament. So we have the kind of the culmination of what Daniel has foretold back at this stage right here. So now we're jumping to Jesus. Jesus has finally came on the scene, and even he is talking about a kingdom. Somebody, if you're there, read Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Oh, was that Matthew 2, 1, 2? Or maybe I wrote the wrong verse down. I'm sorry. You were right, I was wrong. Matthew 3 is what I was looking for. It says, in those days John the Baptist came into the wilderness of Judea proclaiming, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. I apologize, that's my bad. But I think I have this one right. Matthew 4, verse 17. Let's try that one. Kingdom of heaven is near. And somebody else please read Mark chapter 1 verses 14 and 15. So Jesus is telling us something is coming. You've been promised this kingdom. You've been promised this one that will never go away. It's here. It's coming. Again, people at that time, they didn't understand it. They were looking for a Alexander the Great is really what they were looking for, right? They were looking for someone to kick the Romans out, to set them all up as like they were back in First and Second Kings. And Jesus is saying, that's really not the case here. But the kingdom I'm referring to Jesus, it's here. It's almost here. He's trying to get everybody ready for this kingdom. So, the question that we really get to right now. So this is where we'll be able to finish this one, and then we'll pick up the rest of it next week. How do we value the kingdom? So we talked a lot about a kingdom, right? I said we're going to mention kingdom a lot. We've talked about a kingdom. We talked about how kingdoms throughout history, they've come, they've gone, they've been powers, they've been, this and that. We had a promise of an everlasting kingdom, right? So now that we have this, Jesus has gave us this everlasting kingdom that will never go away, that will always be How do we handle that? How do we treat that? And this, in what we talked about, this is kind of where everything kind of comes home to us. How do we do this? Let's look at these. We've got a couple parables we're going to talk about. The first one is the parable of the hidden treasure. Would somebody please read Matthew chapter 13, verse 44? That's right. So we have he's found a treasure in a field. There's a translation of the Bible called the Message. And I don't necessarily recommend that to everyone. It's a little different in some areas. But one of the things that I think it does do well, that sometimes we, in some of the translations, leave out, is the emotion. There's some emotion in a lot of these verses that, especially the King James, it has a hard time getting its hand around. It does good, but it can leave out some stuff. So we can read some verses, and we don't really get kind of what the author was conveying toward us. So for this one, the Message, I think, does a good job of this. I want to read that same verse from a different translation. And it says, God's kingdom is like a treasure hidden in a field for years and then accidentally found by a trespasser. The finder is ecstatic. What a find! Exclamation point. And proceeds to sell everything he owns to raise money and buy that field. Same words, it's just it has a little bit of different context. But and then in those days, of course, we all know it was very, very common for people to bury valuables and bury this kind of stuff. But what we want to focus on is that man's reaction. How did he react? When he found something of value. What did he do? I mean, aside from he sold everything and went and bought it. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, if you think about us and we go out and we find, buried pirates' gold doubloons in our backyard. I mean, what would we do? I mean, we would be jumping up and down and screaming and hollering. I mean, because can you kind of see that's what this man was doing, right? I mean, he was just so overwhelmed, so happy that he had found this, that he went and sold everything he had. Have we ever found something that we go and sell all that we ever had? I mean, we found something, we'd go sell our house, go sell our car. I mean, I know that's maybe a stretch for, again, today versus then, but, that's kind of what we need to think about. I mean, this man was extremely happy. When we talk about valuing the kingdom, I mean, in this parable, Jesus is talking about the kingdom. And he's talking about, how happy this individual was that he found that. I mean, the question we ask ourselves today, does it mean that much to us? Are we like this guy? Are we selling everything we have because it means that much to us? And that's a question we all have to ask ourselves. I mean, that's it's different for me, it's different for you, but that's, when we think about this, when we think about this kingdom and how much it means, I mean, ultimately we realize that, Jesus gave his life for it, right? I mean, God sent his son to die for us for this right here. And that, that comes back to us. What do we do with that? What does that mean to each one of us? Then we got time to read this one. So maybe we're going to read Matthew 13, just continue on in the same chapter, verse 45 and 46. It says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking for fine pearls. When he found a pearl of great value, he went out and sold everything he had and bought it. Those sound very similar, right? I mean, if you read those verses, those parables back to back, they kind of sound very similar. But what's interesting is they are both very different. And I want to talk about just the differences real quick before we wrap up tonight. It says a significant difference between the parable of the hidden treasure and that of the pearl of great price would seem to be that in the former, which means the parable of the hidden treasure, the man accidentally found the treasure. Whereas in the latter narrative, the parable of the pearl, the merchant was seeking for a godly pearl. Perhaps this represents two classes of persons which are exposed to the gospel. On one hand, there are those who are pursuing their lives, busily engaged in daily activities, who are wholly unaware of what they are missing by ignoring spiritual realities. They then may be exposed to the truth by means of a neighbor or some other method of evangelism, and thus are thrilled with their new discovery. They stumble over the word of grace, recognizing its value, and readily receive it. The Samaritan woman in John chapter 4 may be an example of such. When she went for water at Jacob's well that day, little did she dream that she would find the treasure of spiritual water whereby her thirst could be quenched eternally. So when we think about that, you have this person who's just, they're going through life, they're, not really aware of anything, and all of a sudden, one of us tells them something, and they're like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. And then they grab it with everything they own, right? I mean, it just they attack it, and they value it above all things. And so on the other hand, there are those who know their lives are just a mess. They are so very unhappy. They are looking for something to provide them with contentment of the soul, and in their hunger and thirst for righteousness, they discover the pure gospel and forsake all to possess it. Nicodemus appears to be someone who would fit that example of that one. But thank you for your patience. I know we talked a lot about history. I appreciate you being attentive, and we will finish up this in a couple weeks, and we'll start on another one. Thank you.